Hello, hello. Welcome in, everyone. Super excited to have you all here this morning with us with KASFAA. My name is Daisha Holmes. I'm going to be your moderator today. I am with JCCC here in Overland Park, Kansas. Today we have our legendary presenters. They're going to be talking about some special circumstances and unusual circumstances. Some of the things are the same. A lot of them are new. So we're going to have a conversation about that today. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We will be able to go over them before you all exit out today. So to present to you our presenters, we have the Brenda Hicks, Danielle Sullivan, Liz, and we also have Melinda as well that are joining on as a panel today. We are all from different types of institutions, and we'll be able to chime in and offer you all the best KASFAA presentation we can offer here for you all today. Super exciting. I'm going to start the PowerPoint and pass it on to our presenters. And then we're going to go ahead and have a good time. So, all right, y'all, prepare to buckle up as we go into these Stranger Things.
So good morning, everyone. I will start us off. So my name is Danielle Sullivan, and I'm with Johnson County Community College. Daisha, do you see this PowerPoint? Does it kind of look weird? I'm not sure what's happening.
Yes, I think it got scared and got froze. I'm not sure what's going on.
Okay.
It started to do its own thing.
Do you want me to try to share a different one with you?
It's working from, now it froze.
Yeah, it just froze. Huh. I think our PowerPoint's being shy. Let me start again from the top.
I wonder if you can just skip to the slide with our names on it. Oh, it's going.
There it goes. There we go.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to kick us off today. My name is Danielle Sullivan. I'm with Johnson County Community College, and we've got Brenda Hicks from Southwestern, Melinda Harrington from Garden City Community College, and Elizabeth Weiler from University of Kansas. We're going to do a very, very short presentation for you all first, and that's because there are a lot of changes. So we wanted to kind of go through that first because that might answer some of the questions that you all have today. All right, next slide, please, Daisha. So first, we're going to talk about some new terminology. So with the brand new FAFSA starting for 24-25, there's a lot of new terminology that we all need to learn moving forward. So we're going to go over some of these terms that you're going to begin to see once we start doing the 24-25 FAFSA. And just as a reminder, the new FAFSA does not come out until sometime in December. We're thinking, well, I'm thinking late December, like December 32nd is going to be my guess. So Congress has established that the FAFSA does have to be released by January 1st at the latest. But I'm thinking it's going to come out later rather than earlier, so we can all kind of place our bets on when the new FAFSA is going to come out. With new FAFSA, they're moving to a role-based completion system, meaning that each contributor will need to complete their own section on the FAFSA. So that means the parent needs to do their portion, the student needs to do their portion, and never the twain shall meet. So each contributor will need to log on and do their own section on the FAFSA. So a contributor is going to be anyone who's going to be required to complete their information on the FAFSA. So that could be the student. It's always going to be the student's spouse if the student is married, could be a biological or adoptive parent, or even a step parent if their biological parent is remarried. So all of those folks will be or could be contributors to the new FAFSA. With being a contributor, everyone needs to provide consent on the FAFSA. So that means each contributor needs to go in and click, yes, I consent to have my information used on the FAFSA, because we're moving towards a direct data exchange with the IRS, meaning that the student and parent will no longer need to click, I'd like to use the IRS data retrieval tool. It pulls it over. It's an automatic link up the minute they provide their consent. It searches the IRS database and will pull over the tax information automatically without the student or parent having to click through additional screens. The expected family contribution is also going away, and it's being replaced with the student aid index. So that will be the measure by which a student and family can contribute towards their education. And it's going to be negative. So it can be negative 1,500. So that's going to be something new for all of us to kind of get used to. And then what we're going to talk about today are the items on the right. So a student who may have unusual circumstances. So that means that they are not able to provide their parents' information on the FAFSA because they have some kind of circumstance that prevents them from doing so. They could come through as a provisional independent student. So that means that a student aid index will be calculated. Right now, students who have unusual circumstances do not have an EFC calculated. It comes through as a rejected FAFSA. But moving forward, they will have an SAI calculated. They will be on the school's radar, and we will follow up with those students. And then students could also have special circumstances. So those are items that are going to impact the student's financial picture, financial snapshot, something that has changed within their family, where the information on the FAFSA no longer accurately reflects their situation. So those are all a bunch of new terms that we are all going to learn together. Next slide, please, Daisha. Okay, so what has not really changed are the items needed to file the FAFSA. So the students are still going to need that FSA ID, and they are moving to begin calling it a studentaid.gov account. So we might see that language phased out as well. So you, just like 11, the FSA ID is the most important thing on the FAFSA. You can't really do anything without the ID. You'll also still need tax returns, and kind of like Will, who went to the upside down, sometimes our tax returns do too, and we can't find them. And some folks really struggle getting that tax information, but hopefully that direct data exchange will make it a little easier. It'll go to the upside down for you, retrieve it, and put it right on your FAFSA. So we will still need tax returns, and we are still using prior year, so that has not changed. We also need asset information, which could include child support received, cash savings checking, investment net worth, and business and farm net worth. And Liz and Brenda will talk a little bit later about those items on the FAFSA and if things happen to change. And then students can list up to 20 colleges on the FAFSA. That's a change from this year, which you can only list 10. We know Dustin, he's really smart. He's going to be listing 20 colleges on his FAFSA. And then federal benefits. So students still will have a simplified needs calculation. They're calling it exempt from asset reporting. And some families who meet certain income thresholds or who have federal benefits such as free and reduced school lunch or WIC or temporary assistance for needy families or TANF, those families could potentially not have to report assets on the FAFSA. So a lot of this is remaining unchanged moving forward into 24-25. Next slide, please. All right, chapter 2, let's dive into unusual circumstances. So this is new terminology, but just to kind of review, the student who might have some unusual circumstances will be able to completely bypass that parent information and not have to put that on the FAFSA. So if a student cannot answer yes to any of the dependency questions, and we'll go over those in just a second, they can still indicate that they have some kind of unusual circumstance that they cannot provide their parents' information. And bypass that parental information. They can also state that they don't have an unusual circumstance, but their parents are unwilling to provide that support on the FAFSA and bypass the parent information as well. So these students will come through as a provisional independent student, which was one of our new pieces of terminology. And those students will be on the financial aid office's radar, and we're required to follow up with students who are provisionally independent within 60 days of enrollment at our institution. So for example, at JCCC, we run a list every week of students who did not put parent information on the FAFSA, and we email them and then we follow up with a phone call to see what their circumstances may be. Next slide, please. So before we get into unusual circumstances, let's review the dependency questions. So if a student can answer yes to any of these questions, they do not have an unusual circumstance. So that means essentially being 24 years of age or higher, if the student is themselves married, if the student is active duty or veteran, if they have children or other dependents that they support by more than 50%, if they're an orphan, ward of the court, or in foster care since turning 13, if they're an emancipated minor, if they're in legal guardianship with someone other than their biological or adoptive parent, or if they indicate they are homeless or at risk of being homeless. None of these are considered unusual circumstances. And at a lot of schools, the student just provides documentation of the status, and then they can be independent and not have to put their parent information on the FAFSA at all. So these are the questions that the FAFSA is going to ask. And again, if they can answer yes to any of these questions, they do not have unusual circumstances. Next slide, please. So let's say that they do have unusual circumstances. So you all are seeing screenshots from the FAFSA for 24-25. So you get to kind of see this before other folks do. This is the screen that's going to pop up if they indicate that they might have unusual circumstances. So you can see some examples on here if they left home due to an abusive environment, if they've been abandoned or they're not in contact with their parents, if they have possibly refugee or asylee status, they're a victim of human trafficking, if they've been incarcerated or their parents are incarcerated and contact would be a risk to both of them, or if they just cannot contact their parent and they don't know where their parent is. So all of these would be considered unusual circumstances. And all of these are going to require documentation to be submitted to the institution. So again, schools kind of know when these students come through like this, and we're going to require that the student provides some kind of documentation. And that's what this panel is all about today. So we're going to be going into situations and scenarios and the types of documentation that we might see on our end. So again, they'll be considered provisionally independent. So what happens if they don't have unusual circumstances? Next slide, please. But maybe they indicate that their parent is just not willing to provide that consent. Remember, if you don't provide consent, you don't get financial aid. Everyone's going to be required to provide consent on the FAFSA. So what happens when the parent will not consent? Let's say the parent has ended financial support, or they're just refusing to put their information on the FAFSA or provide consent. The student can apply for an unsubsidized loan only. So this would only be in very, very rare cases. I think I get 2 of these a year because we try to persuade them to get their parents' consent. But this would be if they do not have an unusual circumstance. So they're in contact with their parents, they're, on great terms, but the parent just doesn't want to provide support or says, oh, the student's on their own. Well, unfortunately, unless you can answer yes to those dependency questions or have an unusual circumstance, the philosophy of the FAFSA is you have to put parent information. But a student does have the option if the parent just refuses, but they don't meet the other criteria, they can apply for an unsubsidized loan only by checking this box on the FAFSA. Now, I do want to stress that it means the student will receive no Pell Grants, no subsidized loan, no work study. They can only get an unsubsidized student loan for about $5,500 for their first year, and then $6,500 their second year, and $7,500 their third and fourth year. So it's a minimal amount. At schools like a community college, that could go a long way, but at a public school or a private school, that might not even touch their tuition. So that's why we reach out to these students to really figure out what the situation is and what can we do to help. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about who can make a homeless determination. So we talked a little bit about the unusual circumstances. But this question often comes up amongst folks. So if a student indicates that they are homeless, the following can make a determination on homelessness. So that would be the director of an emergency or transitional shelter, a McKinney-Vento rep. And if you work in a high school, you probably know that each district is required to have a McKinney-Vento representative to work directly with homeless students. Kind of new on bursting onto the scene this year are TRIO Gear Up people. So beginning with this academic year, those who work in TRIO or Gear Up can also make a homeless determination. And then of course you've got a financial aid administrator. So we can also make homeless determinations for students. Now, I do want to stress that the student has to not only be homeless, they have to be unaccompanied. So that is in the definition that you see above. They have to be unaccompanied and homeless. So if they're in the custody of their parent, let's say the whole family is in a shelter, that would not be considered meeting the definition of homeless and unaccompanied. Next slide, please. So our recommendation is on all of these circumstances, the student really needs to follow up with all the individual colleges to see what documentation that they're going to need to turn in order to essentially document their situation. Because as a financial aid administrator, I do need to see documentation. And so each student is going to have to submit that individually. We are required to follow up with these students no later than 60 days after enrollment. And something new is going to be, we now must accept dependency overrides and homeless determinations from other institutions. In the past, we didn't have to, and we would need to make the student redocument their situation. But now when their FAFSA comes through, I can see that they had a dependency override at Southwestern, and I'm going to accept Brenda's decision. So it's no longer optional. So that means that the student doesn't have to go through this process again at another school. Next slide, please. All right, chapter 3, undocumented and DACA students. So I wanted to touch a little bit on this group because we often see them at our institutions. We have quite a few students who are undocumented, and then we have quite a few students whose parents don't have a social security number or are otherwise undocumented. So with the new federal student aid ID process, a parent without a social security number will now be able to set up an FSA ID without having a social security number. Right now, those of you who are familiar know that a student whose parent doesn't have a social security number have to go through the paper signature process and have their parent physically sign. You've got to print that signature page, they sign it and mail it back. That will not be the case anymore. There will be no more signature pages with the FAFSA. Those are going away. So we don't know what the process looks like yet. FSA has not released how they plan to do this. It will probably be released at the exact same time as the FAFSA. My insider knowledge insider contact has told me that it's not going to be before. It's going to be probably with the actual FAFSA when that gets released. However, this is great news for us. This really helps the families out. So they will be able to go in and set up that ID through the electronic process. And what's remaining unchanged is that if a student's parent doesn't have a social security number, they're still going to enter all zeros in that social security number field. They will also be able to just not have a rejected FAFSA. So make sure you're entering all zeros and not like a 9, all 9s. Some people enter all 9s. That will cause the FAFSA to have issues. So they're going to enter all zeros. And just to reiterate, the parent's citizenship doesn't affect student eligibility, only the student's citizenship status. Now, for students who are undocumented or have deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA, they are currently not eligible for federal or state aid in the state of Kansas. Now, they could be eligible in other states, state residents are, but in Kansas, our students are not eligible for state aid. However, our undocumented or DACA students could potentially qualify for essentially in-state tuition at Kansas colleges if they attended an accredited Kansas high school for 3 or more years, and they graduated or they earned their GED, and they have to fill out an affidavit at the institution. So students really do need to be careful though when they file a FAFSA. I went to a citizenship workshop with an immigration attorney a couple of years ago, and She works with a lot of folks who are trying to get their citizenship status. And if they accidentally mark that they're a US citizen or an eligible non-citizen box, if they are ever up for citizenship in the future, they will not receive it and they will be deported because it's considered falsifying data or information on a federal application. So I'm very careful when I work with undocumented or DACA students. I normally tell them not to file the FAFSA because if they accidentally pick the wrong box, it could jeopardize their entire future. So please be mindful and very careful when you are helping students with this status file applications. Some states require a FAFSA no matter what, or some schools. I would encourage the student to reach out to the school to see if there's an alternative way to measure their income level instead of filing the FAFSA. There is a student aid estimator out there that could be used. So I would encourage the student to figure out if there's something else they could file except for the FAFSA. Next slide, please. All right, Chapter 4, foster care. I wanted to add this because we get a lot of questions in these types of presentations. So students who are in foster care in the state of Kansas through the Department of Children and Families, or DCF, they don't have to pay tuition and fees at certain Kansas colleges. So that applies to our vocational and technical schools, our community colleges, the municipal university, which is Washburn, and our state educational institutions and technical colleges. So like KU, K-State, Johnson County. So they don't have to pay tuition at those colleges. However, they are responsible for paying their food and housing, their books, supplies, and transportation costs. So the application is through DCF, Department of Children and Families, so that a student applies through them. And then they work with the institutions to essentially get the student to not be charged their tuition. And every school might handle this differently. At JCCC, our admissions office actually handles this whole process. And we can put a little code on a student's account to not have the system charge them tuition. So that's how we do it. And other schools might do that a different way. Some schools might consider it third-party billing, and they work directly with the bursar's office to do that. So the criteria in order to qualify, and I pulled this directly from the application, they have to be in the custody of DCF and in foster care placement on or after their 18th birthday. They have to be released from the custody of DCF before the age of 18 and graduated from high school or received their GED while in foster care. Or they could have been adopted from foster care on or after their 16th birthday, or released from foster care placement subject to a guardian under Chapter 38 or 59 on or after their 16th birthday. They also have to remain in good academic standing. So they have to meet the school's academic standing policies in order to receive this. And I put the link at the bottom, but if you go to Google and you just type foster care fee waiver Kansas, this is literally the first thing that pops up. All right, next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Liz.
Liz, you're on mute.
Thank you so much. All right. So Danielle had mentioned something about special circumstances. The main thing is we know, and what's been mentioned is the FAFSA is looking at prior year information for all those financial data elements. So the income listed on the FAFSA may no longer accurately portray the student's financial situation. Life happens. So some of the things we look at, and this is a case-by-case situation. This is when you hear PJ, professional judgment situation, schools don't have to agree, again, case by case. What we do is when these conversations start, a student or parent might mention something and we're thinking, oh, some things have happened between the years, the data that's in the FAFSA and what's going on right now in the household. So we encourage conversations with anyone financial aid counselors mainly, to look and see exactly what the changes look like. So loss of income is a big one. Going through those years, dealing with COVID, the pandemic, we saw a lot of this. total job loss, reduction in hours, maybe retirement, early retirement, things like that, receiving Social Security benefits, a death in the family, divorce. Then we get into excess medical costs or dental costs for the family. Also, if, investment funds, if there's been an insurance payout, like a one-time payout, inheritance, taking something out of your retirement fund. We also look at private school tuition for siblings, student loan payments. So those are some of the things that we look at. Also, we want to make sure we're always operating within the guidelines that we're given and the law. So we would not be, doing anything to intervene or circumvent the law. So, but these are conversations that come up a lot in orientation and throughout the year. And these are some of the things that we can consider. The goal would be to update the FAFSA or look at and change some data elements based on this information, the guidelines that we are given, and that would be to lower that student aid index. Next slide. All right, and this is a change this year, I should say, for the 24-25 FAFSA. But the FAFSA will still ask for the number in college. The formula to determine a student's aid eligibility will no longer take the number in college into consideration. So this is something new. Again, it may cause, or additionally, it may cause some students to lose aid eligibility that they were previously receiving. So this is something new that will come up in conversation. All right, next slide.
Thanks, Liz. I'm gonna take over from here. So my name's Brenda Hicks again. We're switching a little bit. Another kind of special circumstance we can also do as institutions is called cost of attendance increases. And so this is a different way of getting at the cost of college and helping students out who may need a little additional assistance. Now, just like Liz said, different schools do different things in this area, and it just depends on really what the costs are. One, for example, here's the slide shows the list of things that are common within institutions. But one thing that I find myself doing at a private college like Southwestern often is using actual costs for housing and food if I have a student who's bringing in a lot of scholarships and I need to fit those scholarships within a financial need calculation or a tuition total cost of attendance. Sometimes it reaches that far. I'll go ahead and upgrade their cost of attendance from the average that I've used to actual. And that sometimes assists and helps the student fit all that scholarship money in there without me having to adjust things. Now, also on the flip side of that, we don't normally do cost of attendance increases for things like a computer, simply because at Southwestern, a computer is included with tuition. So there's no real need for a student to go out and purchase a computer on their own. Now, that said, my son, when he went to school, he started early and he had a lower enrollment status, and his enrollment status did not allow us to borrow enough money through a PLUS loan to get him a new computer to take to college. So we did approach the financial aid office at my son's institution and asked for their process to increase the cost to include so that we could include enough money to purchase a computer for him. And we were given the directions on how to do that. And we supplied the receipts and were able to do that. So these kind of things are possible. I thought I would call on my friend Melinda from Garden City. She does far more of these, and she can talk a little bit about her institution and how they do these increases there. Melinda?
Good morning. So as Brenda mentioned, we do some of these. One that comes to mind immediately is our welding program. So it's a high technical program here at Garden City Community College, a higher cost than normal. So as Brenda mentioned, I use averages when I build their cost of attendance. So I use an average. I don't do it by program, and the government allows us to just use an average. So we do talk to our welding students a lot about, if you have extra tools or extra fees that are not in that cost, then we can do an adjustment. And our process is very simple. It's just a form. We have them fill it out, and then they provide receipts or show us how their costs are more. So then what that does is allow us to increase the cost of attendance and maybe allow for a subsidized loan, or as Brenda mentioned, additional scholarships to help fill their need. So cost of attendance, just as a reminder, is your very first building block of determining financial need. So that's kind of how we do it as financial aid administrators. And we don't we don't supply a computer at this institution. So sometimes I even allow them to give me a projected cost because they need the loan to go buy the computer, so they can't really give me a receipt. So I do allow a projected cost, and the computer is just a one year, one time only expense. So those are just a few other examples.
Great, thanks, Melinda.
Mhm.
Yeah, so cost of attendance is something that's kind of behind the scenes. It's not the bill. It confuses families a lot, but it is something that can be approached and looked at. And you should be able to see the cost of attendance at any school. Your people should be able to see it on their financial aid offer, so they can see exactly what's being used and how much is there and how much room they have. Most of the time, I will say, most of the time the school's created cost of attendance is sufficient to cover the costs that are incurred and anything that is there. But it's something to look at, like, for example, in the case of my son in his first semester at college, it's something to look at for increases to help. Go ahead. That's, I think, next slide. This next slide we have, I think this is the end of the presentation part of this wonderful thing, and we'll open it up for questions. But we wanted to let you know, KASFAA is the professional association, as many as you know, and we have this QR code here is a link to the counselor training site where all the future trainings are located, and you can sign up for those, and the handouts are there. Coming up in November, there will be I've looked it up here on my phone. Coming up in November, there will be a presentation about scholarships. And then coming up even into the future, the dates have not been determined, probably because we don't have information, complete and accurate information from the feds yet, but I'm sure the committee will get these scheduled as soon as we do. But there will be some of these for the changes in FSAID, which I just learned, guys, last week. It is no longer going to be called an FSAID. It's going to be called a studentaid.gov account. So we're all trying to figure that one out together amongst all the other changes. But so there will be changes to what we now know as the FSAID. Actually, the process doesn't change. The thing doesn't change. We're just calling it a studentaid.gov account because it means more. And is more probably accurate in today's nomenclature. So that is the end of the slides, I believe. Danielle and Daisha, whoever's moderating.
Yes, that is the end of our presentation today. As far as more information to give you all, we do have some questions that were sent in before that we will answer today, and I will pass it on to our expert speakers for today. But yes, if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And I've also attached our evaluation form so we can continue to make our presentations better and cater them all to you. So I'm going to pull up our questions here that were pre-asked so we can answer you all's questions today. All righty. Okay, one of the first questions is, are only accompanied homeless considered in the homeless designation? So I'm assuming only are unaccompanied homeless minors considered a part of the homeless determination.
And the short answer is yes. A student must meet two pieces of the definition. They have to be considered unaccompanied and they have to be considered homeless. So they have to meet both of those pieces. We had an interesting situation here at JCCC where we received a letter from a McKinney-Vento representative, and normally we wouldn't look twice, but right in the letter they said the student is not unaccompanied. So unfortunately, because the student was in the physical custody of their parent, we were not able to make a homeless determination and accept that McKinney-Vento letter. And the parent actually had a really good job, but they were living in a shelter. So because of the parent's income, they did not qualify for Pell Grant either. So unfortunately, we weren't able to make that student independent. She did have to put her parent on the FAFSA. Other schools, do you all have any cases like that?
Most of the circumstances I've seen that I have made independent have been unaccompanied. So I've not actually had an accompanied homeless child. So.
Makes sense. Thank you all. So the second question that was also pre-asked is what kind of documentation is required for students to put on their FAFSA during their freshman year of college? This person was stating that when they're a senior, they're able to help, the school counselors are able to help provide information, but now that the student has moved on, where do they get their resources to get help putting information on the FAFSA?
I think that's a great question because we do know that freshman year, everybody's preparing them for freshman year. And then, where do they get help from after that? The number one answer would be that financial aid office, wherever they're attending. They're going to be the most knowledgeable. They're the most trained. So I would encourage any former students to definitely go into the financial aid office. And it's also important that they do it in a timely manner because they could lose out on some funding if they wait and kind of delay it. So definitely getting them just directing them to that financial aid office. If for some reason there's issues or they're not helping the student, then you could get more involved. You could reach out to anybody in KASFAA and we could try to help that sophomore student with their second year application.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. The next question that we have is who is authorized to declare someone to be homeless?
Can you repeat that, Daisha? I didn't hear the.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Who is authorized to declare a student to be homeless?
Oh, thank you. So there are essentially 4 entities. There's the director of a homeless shelter. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a HUD approved homeless shelter either. That's a change. It used to be HUD approved, but it can be any director or designated person of a shelter that helps homeless folks. It has to have that. So then you have your Trio Gear Up folks who can make a homeless determination. You've got the high school McKinney-Vento representatives, and then of course, financial aid administrators.
I did notice, oh, sorry. I did notice on the feedback that many of you don't know your McKinney-Vento rep, and I would recommend that if you don't know, if that is you on this call, that you find out who that is. It's sometimes in the district office as opposed to the individual schools. And so but that is a resource, and that is a huge resource for us. That letter is really, really, really helpful when it exists.
And I also wanted to add that a financial aid administrator, of course, can also make that determination. So sometimes I do reach out to a counselor, even though you're not the McKinney-Vento. So say that a student did not qualify, or your district liaison cannot say that they're a McKinney-Vento. For whatever reason, they didn't have the correct paperwork, maybe while they were in high school. So if a student comes to me, I do a quick interview, the least amount of questions that I need to get through, make sure that they feel comfortable, they know it's kept confidential. Once I do a quick interview, then, I can make determination myself as a financial aid administrator. but I can only do that for my school if the student's attending my college. So definitely, you know, if it's for some reason it's not documented, we know that those situations exist, that they've been living with, you know, a friend on a couch, but it's not a shelter, it's not a HUD, it's not, maybe the school district didn't get it identified. Know that we as financial aid administrators can work through that with a student as well.
The other thing I forgot to add that is super, super important, so I apologize, is that it's good for the entire time that the student is in school. They do not need to submit documentation each year. What they will do to recertify their circumstances is on the FAFSA, it says, is this still your circumstance? And they would indicate yes. And because we made a determination the year before, that status will carry over to the second year, and the student does not need to take any action. The financial aid office will automatically accept that status from the prior year, as long as the situation remains unchanged and as long as we don't get conflicting information. And by conflicting information, here's a great example. We had a student who was approved for a dependency override, and then she came to her next appointment with her mother, and they were very much in contact, and the student really shouldn't have gotten that dependency override. So that would be conflicting information.
Thank you all. This question will most likely require the whole panel because it depends on the school. So would a student be able to do a PJ when they have unexpected health costs during their current year and not all the bills have been paid? Or are they able to do it if they're anticipating a loss of work but have not lost their job at that point?
I can go ahead and address that first. And you're absolutely right, Deja. Everybody might have a different answer here because, again, it's up to the financial aid administrator. At Garden City Community College, when we're doing that, we do require receipts, documentation proving that they did use their income. It's no longer available before we make a FAFSA adjustment. So even though they are forecasting that they're going to pay those bills, we don't allow that. We would make them produce receipts showing that.
Yes, the same here at KU. So one of the things that we run into is that initial conversation and meeting, let's say with the financial aid counselor, where we talk about how the student family was impacted. We might be looking at a tax return for 2022, or we're looking at information for 2023. Parent, maybe earlier in the year, not employed, job loss, trying to find another job. And then we maybe wait a little bit to see if they are employed by the end of the year. With medical expenses, we might hear, this happened in the spring of 2023. But in the conversation, we find out that there were medical expenses in 2022. So we look at the year where they were impacted the most. So we are looking at paid out-of-pocket medical expenses. So paperwork with insurance claims, things like that, that we need to look at the actual paid expenses. So if, we're looking at 2 years, we're going to go with the one where they were impacted the most. We don't split years. So again, it would have to be paid medical expenses, and just a little bit of other info on that when we were talking about cost of attendance. We do that same thing where we know that the reason for the cost of attendance appeal and the budget adjustment is so that they can borrow the money to pay for that expense. So we would take, maybe if it was car repair, an estimate, and then they will follow up with that actual receipt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we at Southwestern, we would definitely do a PJ for medical expenses. And even if they're not paid, we'll take bills, we would want to know, usually on a medical bill, there's a part that's submitted to insurance. And so we would take that into account. And then we would look at what's already covered as medical expenses in the calculation itself. So in the FAFSA calculation, there is an allowance for medical expenses, and we would look at that to see for that family what that is, and see if the medical expenses that are being submitted, the out-of-pocket ones, are above and beyond where their allowance. The other one, anticipation of losing a job, we would probably wait until the job is actually lost. It's good to know that. And the families, I would thank them for letting me know that, and I would keep in touch with that family and make sure everything's going well for them before actually doing the PJ. There's a really good question in the chat, and I was about to type a little book here, but I think
It looks like Danielle tagged that one.
rather than type it, yeah, Danielle typed a book. But
Do we want to go back and read the questions from the beginning to go over the answers?
yeah, we could. I
Absolutely.
want to address this last one though. So the student,
Okay.
the 60-day requirement is a requirement, right? So that is what the government does to put boundaries on a process. I think you will find that most of us, it's actually 60 days from enrollment. So if they early enroll, that's when the clock starts ticking for all schools. But I would say to you in general that my colleagues, I know who they are, students who qualify for these kinds of circumstances, we try to help them as fast as we can. We're not going to be looking at that 60-day requirement and going, oh, I have 60 days. I am going to be looking at that PJ or that request and helping that student well ahead of their enrollment at the school and making sure they are together and helpful. That's one of the reasons, most of my colleagues, including these people on this panel today, have a heart for students that are unaccompanied and that are in these circumstances, and we want to get them comfortable as fast as we possibly can. But the 60 days is like the cutoff, right? The government says you have to do it by that time. Most of us will do it earlier.
Yeah, and that was created because students sometimes had issues with schools actually following up and getting their determination made in a timely manner. So that's kind of the impetus behind that. But also we load FAFSAs once a week. We're not loading 24-25 yet. We will start loading 24-25 in February, hopefully after all the bugs and the system is fixed after it breaks down, because we anticipate that there absolutely will be issues. So we're waiting a little bit. But once that process starts, we run a weekly list of students with this status. So we would be reaching out about a week after we load their FAFSA in February. So students are not going to not know by August. If that's the case, it's because they didn't follow up. Because we call them, we email them, they get several emails. So that's kind of our process.
And I would just like to add, I mean, you who are aware of that, you as a high school counselor, because our email or our text or our letter that goes to the student might not be read. That's where we really want to have you guys help the student also by encouraging them to come in and have it, ask them, have you checked your email? Did you get anything yet? Can I walk you over to the financial aid office, or can I, whatever you guys can do to help with those special circumstances, for sure, because it's scary to them, and we understand that, and we're trying to do our outreach, but we don't know them like you do yet. I mean, that's our goal, is to get them, a familiar face on our campus, but it is very scary for them. So any, Gear Up people or TRIO people or high school counselors, like if you know of those and they're, close by, just offering that extra support might help us get to where we can help them.
Absolutely. So this last question that was pre-asked is, how can we reassure students and parents that no one will investigate their family resources if they put all zeros in the parent social security number field or submit a copy of their 1040?
So I do get this question sometimes at my college, and to be honest, I mean, I can never reassure somebody. I don't have control over the government. It is a government application. It comes down to what is your comfort level. And I know that's not a good answer, and I don't like it. Maybe some of the other ladies here on the call have some other advice, but I just talked to them about what it means, and that I've been here 20 years. Nobody's came back and told me how it negatively affected them. So I try to give input, but also let them know that it is a federal form that they're signing, and it's totally going to be their choice.
Yeah, I think this question also gets at just some uncomfortableness around citizenship. And I think what I'm reading into the question is that a person's uncomfortable that maybe the IRS or the immigration folks will come calling if they put the all zeros in the social security number, or they put or if they submit a copy of their 1040 and they think that now they'll be audited by the IRS. And the only thing I say, I agree with Melinda 100%. We can't really control everything. It is a federal form. There are privacy laws, and the agencies are separate. So there's, even though the FAFSA reaches out to different agencies to check things, they are separate and there are walls. So goodness, it took how many years to get the IRS and the Department of Ed to just talk. So I think that the data is pretty secure, but it's hard. It's hard. That's a difficult one.
Yeah, and a lot of our undocumented families file tax returns. I've seen very, very few undocumented families that don't file taxes. So a lot of them have that TIN number. And so that's already on file with the IRS. They're already in the system. So it kind of,
Oh, go ahead.
so if they come in with a tax return, I can reassure them that way that, you know, look, you've been filing taxes for how many years, so this probably won't impact you a lot. But we definitely see fear from some of our students that they don't want to be in the system. I kind of use the analogy, you know, like this whole FAFSA simplification, this was supposed to happen 2 years ago, or 23, 24, and it just didn't happen. And the amount of effort that is taken it for the government to sync up these systems. So if it took that long and it was this big of a deal, I think they're small potatoes and they're probably going to be okay. But again, you know, administrations can change and things can change in the future, and we don't know what that's going to look like. So there is an amount of risk that they do take by doing that.
Yeah, I think the standard answer for conspiracy theory things is that that's making an assumption that the government works way more efficiently than it actually does. And those of us who work with the government understand that on a granular level, I think. There's a good question in the chat. Sorry, if we're ready.
I was just going to say one other thing is I do encourage those families to talk to any immigration lawyers that they might be working with or agencies about, maybe they can give you a little bit more advice on what, if you should do the, you know, disclose that in the FAFSA or not. So sometimes I do direct them back to whoever might be helping with the processes.
So let's go through the chat. Daisha, can you read our first question from the chat?
Yes, I sure can. And if you all have any other questions, please feel free to add them. So if you have like a student in mind that you know there's a specific situation that you kind of want to answer to, please feel free to drop them there. The first question says, can a student who has a refugee status but lives with biological parents be considered independent?
I'm going to let someone else answer since I typed it in the chat.
Daniel's answer was great. Who runs into this more? Melinda, do you run into this more?
Yeah, occasionally. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 a year. So it's a very unique situation. But yeah, it doesn't make them independent. I'm just reading Danielle's catching up here. However, it could possibly be in a dependency override. It just really depends on that student's. More information is what I would do. I would gather more information. And if the student does have a relationship with their parent, it's not toxic or uncomfortable situation, then they would just be required to enter that parent's information on the FAFSA. And then, you know, again, what we just talked about, are they all zeros because they don't have a social security number? That's kind of how I would direct them. Ultimately, though, they would have to still use their parents' information.
We get a lot of refugees. We have quite a few from Afghanistan and Ukraine, and other immigrant communities in the Kansas City area. So we see this pretty frequently. So it all depends if they came with their parent or their parents are here, or they can contact their parent, but in a lot of cases they can't. We did a dependency override for a student who came from Guatemala, and it was kind of the story you probably hear from on the news. She came across the border with a coyote and came without her parents. She has no idea where her parents are. She can't contact them. She went to a Kansas high school. She came here, I think, when she was 13 or 14, alone to the United States, completely alone. Managed to graduate from a Kansas high school, but had that refugee status because she was still waiting on permanent resident. I think her permanent resident card. She ended up getting it pretty soon after her first year here, I think. But with that refugee status, she was considered an independent student because she couldn't contact her parent.
Yes, absolutely makes sense. Now we have a second question. This one is about incarcerated parents. So if your parents are divorced and the student lives with mom, but dad is incarcerated, does that count? I'm assuming, does it count for a dependency override? I can see that being confusing for my student when they go to fill out the form. So what would you suggest for these parents?
On this one, I pointed people to the wizard. There is a wizard, a new wizard that really is pretty clear. I've seen it demonstrated a couple of times now, as I'm sure my colleagues have as well. And the new wizard directs the student to who is the correct contributor. And in this case, I would think the wizard, it would be pretty clear for this young person to understand very quickly that it's not the parent that's incarcerated that they would include on the FAFSA, and it would indeed be the one that they are living with. I don't know how the rest of you on this call feel, but I felt like that wizard has clarified this question quite well for families.
I would agree.
The other thing, though, just because your parent is incarcerated doesn't mean you automatically would qualify to be an independent student. I did work with one student. His dad actually took out parent loans for him. He was out of state when I worked at KU. So the tuition was about $42,000 a year for everything. And he wasn't able to attend without the parent loan. And his dad had good credit, was in prison, and he put his dad on the FAFSA. He didn't have any contact with his mom, and he was able to take out the parent loan for his student for 4 years.
And I will say there, if we knew that at Southwestern, we would probably do a PJ, another PJ that wasn't discussed, to deny that parent the plus loan and give that student independent status for purposes of borrowing. So we would give that student access to a little more money. That's interesting, Danielle. Crazy.
Yep. And I only knew that because I worked with him. And that's how I found out. Yeah. Like I worked with him at a job, I guess I should say. We worked at the same employer for a while. But his dad wasn't going to be there forever and had work release, so he was earning money. So.
There you go.
Makes sense. Another question in the chat. So if a student can track down a parent, but the parent is not assisting them now, and they are living with a friend, will they have to get their parent information on the FAFSA, or would they only qualify for that unsubsidized loan?
This is where it gets sticky, because and where an interview is necessary and where our jobs are required. It's really our job. That interview, guys, is our job. Is the point of the interview is to determine if this is a circumstance where the parent is where there's a relationship issue that is above and beyond just not wanting to support them financially. That is not a reason. It's in regulation. That is not a reason on its own to declare a person independent. There has to be something else involved. I've run into several circumstances where the student could track down their parent, but they were living with people who were abusive, either emotionally or physically sometimes, or they were being extorted. Parents were extorting their student. So there has to be something in addition to just non-financial support. And that's really the point of the interview, is to determine if there is something there.
Yeah, I totally agree with Brenda. Just not assisting them or the parent's refusal to fill out a FAFSA is not a special circumstance. It has to be something that the parent's doing wrong to the student, and the students can actually explain that to us. It's not, we don't dig a lot. We just need a little bit more information to make that determination.
Yeah, we get a lot of questions about, the student is self-supporting, or, my parents don't claim me, I'm not a dependent on their taxes. So that, again, alone doesn't make you independent.
And thanks for mentioning that, Liz. We do get a lot of questions on, I'm not a dependent. I'm not claimed as a dependent. That has nothing to do with it. On those dependency questions we went over, one of them was not, are you claimed as a dependent on a tax return? So I had a fun situation like this. There was a student I worked with who lived on her own. She even owned her own home and paid a mortgage, and she was 23 years old. And she could not answer yes to the dependency questions. She had to put her parent, in this case, her mom, on the FAFSA. Mom had remarried to stepdad, who was kind of wealthy, owned businesses. So that meant she would not qualify for gift aid. She would qualify for a student loan only. And I was her favorite person in the world in the financial aid office, because she had to put her mom and step parent on the FAFSA. And it was not a good situation. It doesn't make you feel good as an administrator to have that information in your head, because you can't accept a dependency override. And she tried literally everything she could think of to get out of that, having to put her parent on the FAFSA. And I get it. She's completely on her own, but unfortunately, in the world that we live in, we need a little bit more than that.
Well, yes, because it's the whole point of this is a lot of times we're put in the middle of Congress, and Congress believes as a group, as a body, the Department of Ed believes as a group, as a body, that parents are responsible for supporting their children, whether they choose to or not. Congress feels that parents are responsible through the age of 24. And so if you are not 24 and you cannot prove that your parents are abusing or neglecting you in some way, because there are those legitimate situations. But if you cannot add that to the situation, then just pure financial support because you as a family believe that once a person's 18, they're on their own, that's not enough. It's just not enough.
And in the scenario that was asked, I would dig a little bit more into the living situation with the friend. Because with a homeless determination, it does not matter why the student left home. So if they didn't like mom or dad's rules, you are not supposed to judge why. You're only supposed to judge if they meet the definition of homeless and unaccompanied. So if that friend could kick them out at any moment, then that is something we could consider. Also, just so you all know, if a student is attending a school with on-campus housing and they're living in the dorms, but they would otherwise be homeless without that student designation, you can still make a homeless determination if the student is living in on-campus housing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for sharing that, Danielle, because we do have students in those situations. And once we start interviewing them, we figure out that's what they're going through.
Yeah, it's actually very easy to tell a person who really truly does not have anywhere else to go, even though they can contact their parents. It's extremely easy to figure that out.
And each college should have their own policy about how they figure that out. And currently I use a Schoolhouse Rock resource that's really nice. Some of you might have that resource as a high school counselor as well. But they have a great little flow chart, that helps you maybe with some of those tough questions, go through that interview process.
I'll find that and throw that in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you all. The very last question we're going to end off on a sweet note is, what might priority deadlines look like for getting the FAFSA completed this year, considering that they're doing a surprise release date on us going soon? Do you all have your priority deadlines set?
Yeah, we are keeping ours at February 1st.
We're a small community college. We don't really have a priority deadline. We just stress, the sooner the better, because we might run out of some campus-based money. So, just encourage them to get it done as soon as possible.
I second Melinda. We're also, though we are not community college, we're private college, we don't hold to priority deadlines, but we do have aid that does. If you want to get considered for the largest amount of financial aid, then you should think earlier rather than later.
And we are keeping our March 15th priority date.
Yes, absolutely. So similar to how Danielle put in the chat, each school might have different priority dates. So definitely make sure you are up to date with whichever institutions your students might be interested in, because some people might be keeping it the same, some people might be changing it, and it can be completely different this year from the next. So please do make sure you are checking with your institutions so we know, what's going on there. I know Danielle just dropped in the chat our Schoolhouse Connection resource, which is an awesome resource for determining homeless and unaccompanied youth. They do a lot of advocacy work and they help the financial aid community and the general community as well. So super excited for that as well. But that's all the questions we have that were asked in the chat that were asked today. So unless you have any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat if anything came in last minute. Other than that, you are free to go and enjoy the rest of your day. I have dropped in the chat our evaluation link as well, so you can help us make our sessions better in the meantime. But yes, thank you so much for joining on today, and we'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.
And I did put the template that we use for the homeless determination in the chat too, if anyone wants to pull that template.
You'll have to read the chat if you want a little humor for the day.
I thought it sounded better.
I know, it got my attention.
I totally think they should come up with a song for that.
Yes.
I even was like, oh, did I get the name wrong? Is it Schoolhouse?
Oh, well, we all need a laugh once in a while.
Sorry.
For sure.
Sorry, you were
Yeah.
close.